Yep, we're live again.
Go ahead.
Yep, you can start talking.
All right, so as I was saying, a client shares with you some situation in which they were really quite agitated, very anxious, maybe feeling unsafe. And so you say, think about that situation and follow my fingers or the light bar or the whatever the bilateral stimulation is. And then how would you rate that on a 1 to 6? 0 to 6, 0 being not stressed out at all, 6 being very, very stressed out. And so they say a 6. Okay, let's try this again. Okay, now how would you rate it? Maybe a 5. Okay, let's try this again. So what would you say now? Well, I think it's down to about a 3. Okay, let's try this again. Okay, I think it's about a 2. Okay, that's good. So we don't know exactly why EMDR works, but what I suspect is that it's bilateral stimulation. I've talked about left and right brain when I was talking about the writing exercise. I also talked yesterday about some clients are very analytical, which is a very right or left brain activity if you're right-handed. And other clients are very emotional, which is a right brain if you're left-handed. No, if you're right-handed, it's left brain. Anyway, one side of the brain is structured and analytical, and the other side of the brain is very emotional. It could be right or left depending on your handedness. Anyway, so when you're doing EMDR, you're doing this eye movement thing, or you're doing the pulse pads or the clicking, you're getting both sides of the brain involved with whatever the target is. The target is that anxiety-provoking situation. And by getting the analytical brain activated and getting the emotional brain activated, they balance each other out. And very often clients move through trauma with less of the extremes of the mental knots that we can get into sometimes by overanalyzing, or the emotional overwhelm that some clients can get into. So they balance each other out, and people actually process through situations and memories a lot more effectively. Like I said, it's too structured for me. I'm not really great at it, so I've only used it on occasion. If a client really wants to get into it, sometimes I'll refer them to one of the other therapists who use it more often and are better at it. And I might sit in and just observe what's coming up, and then we can go back into our own session and sort of work through whatever's come up in the process of doing that exercise. There's also a self-soothing technique where people will go like this. It also is sort of a bilateral stimulation, but it's meant to be self-soothing. There's also a tapping kind of thing where you tap on these various pressure points. I've been trained in that. A friend of mine demonstrated it to me one time. And those are pressure points. And it also does some kind of probably energy, mental energy activation kind of a thing. So EMDR can be quite effective, but it's a very involved training that you have to go through. It's also kind of expensive, and you cannot use it unless you've been formally trained. So even though I've had the training, I didn't go for the advanced training. I'm allowed to use it, but probably if I took the advanced training, I'd probably feel more comfortable with it, and I'd probably be better at it. But, I've got so many other strategies. I don't feel like I need to do EMDR in order to be effective. The next thing on the list is mindfulness, and that really, for some of my staff, that comes from Buddhist practices of mindfulness, about being present, being in the moment, not getting caught up in the what ifs and the the therefores and past, present, future. It's like being in the moment, being present. And one of the ways that we encourage people to be mindful and to be present is through somatic awareness. In other words, what's going on in your body. Sometimes in a session, a client will be really stressed out. It's that it's a very intense, stressful sessions, but you can, if you're paying attention, you can read that there's something going on physically. Your head is all, you're like this, or you're clenching your fist, or it looks like you're really tensed up. Like, what's going on? Tell me what you're aware of in your body. And also this works for dissociation. When clients are just off somewhere, you can say, tell me what's going on in your body. Pay attention to your breathing. Pay attention to, there's this thing, I always get it mixed up, maybe one of the profession. It's a 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. What are 5 things that you see? What are 4 things that you hear? What are 3 things that you taste? I get my 2 things that you can feel. And that brings people, by going through the senses, you bring them back into their body, back into the present. And that's part of mindfulness, is to be able to live comfortably in your body. For survivors of sexual abuse, the body is not a very comfortable place to be because it's been the scene of the crime. And there's body memory. There's where the body holds pain associated to the memory. And there's tension that's locked in. Like when you're feeling unsafe, the body tenses up. So really helping people be tuned into their body, be present in their body, being comfortable in their body is part of really encouraging and building mindfulness. And because survivors dissociate so automatically, they don't even aware that they are dissociated. So mindful practices are quite helpful. There's also a relaxation technique where you systematically move through the body. You start in the head, you tense up your face and now relax. Tense it up and now relax. Tense up your neck muscles and now relax. Now do the shoulder muscles. And you systematically go through every muscle group from head to toe by tensing it up and then relaxing. Okay, relax even further. And that helps relax and alleviate some of the tension, but it also helps them build body awareness. They have control over their body. The body is not control of their psycho-emotional reality. They can have some control over their body by being aware of it, being able to listen to it. There are people that are hungry and they don't even know it. There are people that are tired, don't know it. There are people that are thirsty and they don't realize it because they're so out of tune with their body. So somatic awareness, being able to live comfortably in your body, is an important part of the recovery for survivors. And it's one aspect of mindfulness. But it's also being tuned into interpersonal dynamics, being tuned into your emotional reaction to your environment, being able to be emotionally, physically, psychologically present in your reality. So mindfulness practice is a really good tool to use for your survivor clients. And whether it's a survivor of sexual abuse or physical violence, it's also very effective. Creative therapies is next on the list. And I described the O cards, which is sort of a free association kind of exercise, where you have a large card with a word on all four sides, the same word: anxiety, sexuality, panic, serenity, whatever. And then you've got a smaller image card that fits in the middle of the bigger card. And you can just randomly draw one of each, put them together, and talk about what comes up. And I had a group of guys that really liked the O cards, so they kept, so can we do the O cards again today? And I didn't want to just keep repeating the same exercise over and over again. So the first exercise that I did with the O card was a storytelling exercise, where I would pick a set of cards, and it might be a beach scene, and the word is anxiety. So I start telling the story, and I pick a name that doesn't belong to anybody in the group, and I have to be careful I don't use someone's name, but let's say Fred was walking along the beach one day, and it was a beautiful sunny day, and he started feeling really anxious, and he thought, well, why am I feeling this way? It's a beautiful sunny day, I'm walking along the beach, it's a, I can hear the surf coming in, I should be feeling okay, why am I anxious? But then he has a memory. One summer he was at the beach and some stranger sexually abused him. So then the next person in the group draws a set of cards, and he continues Fred's story based on the cards that he drew. And you go around the group a couple times maybe, depending on how engaged people are. So you keep building the story based on the cards that are drawn. Just sort of a free association thing. I don't know if I mentioned this when I talked about these before, but I don't mind repeating myself, better twice than not at all. At one point, so I was interviewed yesterday somewhere else, and I get them confused. Anyway, at one side of the group, one member was saying, Fred has done a lot of work, and he really feels like he's resolved, and he really feels like he has his life back, and he's really ready to move forward with career and relationships. It got around the other side of the group. Well, Fred's in denial, and he's got a lot more issues he needs to deal with. And then it would go back with, well, he dealt with those issues and he's fine now. And it'd come back to this guy. Oh, well, he still has some more work to do. Well, guess what was going on? This guy was close to resolution, and this guy had a lot of work to do. So they were both projecting their reality into Fred's story. But in any exercise that you do with clients, the most valuable part of it is the debriefing afterwards. And talking about that, okay, what was going on for you that you kept thinking Fred had more work to do? Well, I guess because I have more work to do, and I was just realizing how much how long and arduous this process is, and I really have a lot more to do. And okay, well, what was going on for you? Well, I've been in therapy now for 3 years, and I really feel like I've got my ducks in a row, and I feel like I'm doing all right. Another man in group said, you know, I know I have a tendency to look for the most negative interpretation of any situation, but this exercise really brought home to me how much I do that. You know, I could have interpreted any of these cards in a positive or negative light. I always look for the negative interpretation. And that really helped bring home to me the realization of how much I do that habitually. So it's a good exercise. Another thing that I did with them, with the O cards, we draw a set of cards and talk about mom based on whatever cards you brought up. Again, it's free association. If it's sexuality and an adult looking at a child, well, I got shamed because, you know, I got caught touching myself, you know, so mom shamed me for it. And that's what came up for me. Somebody else is going to say something really different. They might have drawn a different set of cards. Well, I don't know what cards they drew, so I'm not going to go there. But, you know, basically it's on the cards. And then so I say, okay, now draw a set of cards and talk about dad. So based on the cards, you talk about whatever those cards brought up in relationship to dad. Okay, now draw a third set of cards and talk about the most significant sibling. It could be the one that you get along with best, or it could be the one that you have the most conflict with. So just whatever sibling seems the most significant, talk about that. So okay, we did that, and that was pretty easy. And like I say, this group really liked these cards, so I kept inventing exercises on the fly. So I said, okay, I want you to draw a set of cards, and this card refers to some issue that you've dealt with recently, that you feel like you've kind of got some resolution around, and they always find something. Okay, now draw another set of cards, and this is something that you're struggling with right now, and they always find something, and this is where it got spooky. Okay, now I want you to draw a set of cards, and you're on the threshold of confronting something new. So I want you to draw a set of cards and talk about that. And they always were able to identify something. They look at the cards, they look at me, and they, ooh, like these cards do not foretell the future. On some level, we know what's coming. We know what we have to deal with. On some level. It might be subconscious, but it's there. And that's why your psyche is moving you in that direction, because on some level you know. And this card simply brought that out to consciousness. So it's not that these cards know how to foretell the future. It's that you know what's going on some level, and the cards just help you tap into it. So again, it was a really interesting exercise. That was one of the creative exercises I have, creative therapies that I do with clients. Because I did a Bachelor's of Fine Arts in Visual Arts and a Bachelor of Psychology concurrently, I would very often be going from one faculty to the next all in the same day. And there were so many times that I would get basically the same lecture in both faculties. In painting class, we would talk about color salience, people's perception of color. Like an interior designer, for example, will see 12 shades of green. Somebody who's not an artist or an interior designer, well, green. Green is all just one color. They don't really distinguish between the subtle differences between one color and the next. But if you're an interior designer, those subtle differences is relevant. So they're much more attuned to differences in color. And so my professor was talking about that, my painting professor. When I got into my sensation and perception, which is the sight course, they were talking about, at one point, humans only saw black and white. They didn't distinguish colors. I don't know how they figured this out, but they figured that the first color that humans were able to perceive was red. But if you think about that, way back when we were hunter-gatherers, if you're tracking an animal that you thought you shot with an arrow, you need to be able to see the splotches of blood on the ground. If somebody was injured, you have to be able to differentiate between the blood and the mud. So red was a significant color way back when we were hunter-gatherers. And they figured the next color that we perceived was yellow. Well, the sun's yellow. Some plants or some vegetables are yellow, and we need to differentiate between the poisonous flower from the non-poisonous flower, or the edible plant and the non-edible plant. So color perception became more and more important as we evolve as human beings. They don't think that animals see colors. Dogs, cats, whatever. Whether that's true or not, I'm not a dog, I can't tell you. But like I said, interior designers have much more color awareness than we have. So I was really interested in art therapy because I was doing the art and psychology concurrently. Now, that color salience was not the only thing that I heard in both faculties. And people used to say, when I talked about doing art and psychology at the same time, they thought, well, they're so different. Isn't that kind of strange? They're so disparate. And I said, well, not really. In some ways, they're the same. Both psychology and art have to do with our perception of the world around us. One is more internal and analytical and reactive, whereas the other is more expressive and external. But they both have to do with our perception to the world around us and our reaction to that world. So I really see how psychology and visual arts really fit well together. So I was really interested in going into art therapy. But I actually went around to a program, and I could have just entered the program right away because I was doing 2 degrees concurrently. I had all the prerequisites. I had all the studio courses, I had the psych courses, I had all the electives. I could have just walked in right away, but a lot of people that are applying for the art therapy program have come from either visual arts or psychology, and so they have to pick up courses in the faculty in which they did not study. Well, I had them both. But it wasn't a master's granting program, and I realized that there's an advantage to having a master's degree. That little letter at the end of your name lends credibility to your expertise. And also, in reality, there are a lot of compensation programs that will not approve coverage for someone who does not have a bachelor's degree. And there are people that are practicing a therapist with only a bachelor's degree. And fewer as time goes on, because a lot of the associations now require a master's degree, but they had a grandfather clause. If you're working as a therapist, they weren't going to deny you your profession, so they would grandfather you into the association with just a bachelor's degree. And the Psych Association is like that too. I think in Alberta you can be a registered psychologist with a master's degree, but in BC you can't, unless you're grandfathered in the early days of the association. So there are some psychologists in BC that only have a master's degree. So having the right kind of degree lends credibility to your training, will give you access to compensation programs or employee assistant programs that you can't get unless you have that level of training. It's kind of ironic. One of the compensation programs would approve of us as master's level therapists as long as we had a psychologist supervising our work. So I went to a psychologist that I knew and I said, would you supervise our staff so that we can access that compensation program? And his response was, well, yes, if you train me first. I knew more about this work than he did because his training did not include this, but mine did. But the irony is that without that PhD after my name, I was not qualified to get a certain level of compensation coverage. So I found psychologists that were aware enough that were able to provide that supervision. In fact, we have a registered psychologist on staff. Ironically, he started out as a practicum student with me about 17 years ago as a master's student, and now he's a registered psychologist. So I said to him one day, I said, oh, well, now you've gone beyond me. And he said, I'll never go beyond you because you had a 10-year lead on me. And, I keep learning, I keep growing in my knowledge and expertise. And so I may not have that PhD after my name, but I've been approved to supervise doctoral students because I'm recognized as having the level of qualification, of knowledge, and so on. And my agency has a really good reputation. So there are schools that will send their doctoral students to us for training, and that's fine. So some of the art therapy exercises I can continue to learn about because it was important, and we have art therapists on staff that I learned from. Sometimes I'll ask my clients to do a self-portrait. Now they can attempt to do eyes, ears, nose, mouth, or they can do abstract shapes or splashes of color. Represent yourself on the page. The fewer parameters that you provide, the more freedom they have to express themselves. So I just want you to express yourself on the page somehow. And when I was doing my undergrad courses that were the prerequisites for the counseling program, I did a presentation on art therapy. And I brought in art supplies, and I invited everyone to do a self-portrait of some sort. And I said, anything you want to do, you know, try to actually draw yourself or splashes of colors or stick figures, whatever you want to do, just represent yourself on the page. So I gave them some time to do that, and I said, is anyone prepared to share their art? Actually, by the way, just as an aside, I very often refer to it as visual imagery therapy, because some people are really intimidated. I don't know how to draw. I can't do art. And so they get kind of paralyzed. So I say it's visual imagery therapy, or visual expression therapy. Something that doesn't imply that you have to create a work of art. And that makes it less daunting for some clients. So anyway, I asked them to do this art, this self-expression. And I asked if there was anyone that wanted to share, and 2 women agreed. So one woman just had splashes of color all over the page. So I said, okay, what do these colors mean? Explain how these colors represent you. And she said the red is both anger and passion. And there was a fair amount of that. And yellow represented intellectual pursuits and clarity. And blue represented spirituality, I think. This was decades ago, so I can't remember for sure. But all the colors meant something in terms of aspects of the self. But also the dominance of color. Why is it there's so much red going on? Or why is there so little blue going on? Or, you know, tell me about that. There's this area of a color over here that's almost kind of covered over or crowded out by this other color. What was that all about? So getting people to talk about what they put on the paper helps them articulate their self-understanding, their self-awareness. Another woman had done this inverted triangle with a band along the middle, and there was a crescent moon up in the top. And so I asked her to explain what that says about her, and she said, well, I really don't know why I drew this, but it was interesting because as soon as she said that, she started explaining what it meant. She said, I don't know why I drew this, you know, this inverted triangle, but, you know, exam period is coming up. I'm spending all this time studying. I'm in my head all the time, and I'm neglecting my physical health, and I'm getting sick. So there it was, right there in that inverted triangle, all up in my head and ignoring my body and getting sick as a result. Now, I don't remember what she said about the crescent moon, but she said she didn't know why she did it, but the moment she started talking about it, there it was revealing itself. So when it comes to art therapy, there are a couple different schools. There's Jungian art therapy, which looks at archetypes. And I took a course in that, and I thought it was kind of interesting, but it doesn't work for me. And I don't think it really does a good job of analyzing what's going on for the client, because the therapist, the Jungian art analyst, imposes their interpretation, but they're drawing on universal symbols. So, for example, I'm kind of making up stuff here, but I think this is actually true, that there's a belief that if you draw a cherry tree, it means you've been sexually abused. What? But what if you have a cherry tree in the backyard and before you came to session, you went out and you picked a whole bunch of cherries, and when you get home tonight, your mom's going to bake a pie, you know? What if you're a logger and you chop down trees? What if you work as a construction site and you're devastating this orchard because a housing development's going in? So how can the same thing mean the same thing to everybody? So I really don't like the idea of the therapist interpreting someone's artwork. But Gestalt art therapy and Gestalt dream work are quite similar. There's a way of leading the client through the interpretation of either the artwork or the dream, and it works very much the same. I'll start with the artwork. So the client draws a picture, like I did with my 2 fellow students. Tell me what this says about who you are. You can ask questions like, what's going on over here in the corner of the page? Okay, they talk about that. Well, what's going on over here? Tell me about what this is all about. I had a client one time that asked the assignment is to represent your family on the page. It was interesting. Some people, of course, are trying to draw figures, actual human figures. But he was using geometric shapes to indicate the gender, and also what was interesting was the degree of power that the family member had was reflected in how big their shape was. So the big shape was the stepfather, who had a lot of power and control in the family, and one of the smaller figures was a sibling in the family that had the least amount of control in the family. So interestingly enough, the shapes represent the genders, and the size represented the degree of power that the person had in the family dynamic. So that was kind of interesting. So again, the interpretation comes from the client. Tell me about, why are these figures at different size? Why is this figure kind of off to themselves? Why are these two figures kind of bunched up over here? So you can ask questions about it, but the explanation comes from the person doing the artwork. And I really like that way of analyzing art, because it's not me imposing my interpretation. You're helping the clients tap into their own understanding of themselves and their own reality. And it's a lot better than I think Jungian psychotherapy is interesting to study, the 16 archetypes and all that thing. But it's just not something that really appeals to me, because it's my imposition of interpretation. And I think I was talking yesterday about imposing a format on your client. It becomes too much like the offender that's imposing their reality on the client. So I don't want to impose my interpretation or my reality or my anything on my client. So these forms of art interpretation feel more comfortable for me because it comes from the client. Gestalt dream work is very similar. If a client comes to me and says, "So I had this really strange dream last night," I don't ask them to tell me all about it and then I interpret what it means, because I'm not the one who had the dream. So for example, if a client says, "I dreamt I was walking down a hallway," it was a long hallway, and on the left side of the hallway there were some windows looking outside. At the end of the hallway was a doorway, and there looks like an old man kind of sitting in a crouched position right in front of the door. I don't know if he's sleeping or resting, or I don't know what's going on there. So I said, okay. So he describes the dream. I'm walking down the hallway. I approach this man, but then the dream ends. Okay, so now I want you to be the man at the end of the hallway. Okay, I'm an old man. I'm sitting in front of a doorway. I'm sitting like this. I'm pretending I'm asleep, kind of crouched over. And there's a young man walking down the hallway towards me. But I think he wants to get through the door, and I'm here to sort of monitor whether or not he's allowed to get through the front door, through that door. Okay, now I want you to be the door. Okay, I'm a door at the end of the hallway. There's an old man sitting in front of me that monitors who gets through and who doesn't. And there's a young man walking down the hallway towards me, and I think he wants to enter through me. And I'm not sure if I want to let him in or not. I don't know if I want him to give him access to what's on the other side. So that's what the dream was all about. There's some part of the self that hides a lot of information, maybe secrets or whatever. There's a part of the self guarding against access to those hidden secrets, so that hidden part of the self. But there's a part of the self that's moving towards because they're curious and they want to know what's on the other side of the door. But that came from the dreamer, not from me. So when you get the clients to explain the dream as they dreamt it, because it usually comes from the perspective of the self. Okay, now I want you to explain the dream, or describe the dream from the perspective of every other character in the dream. Now I want you to explain the dream from the perspective of any key object in the dream. And by doing that, you get to why those objects are in the dream. Why is that doorway there? Because that doorway protects secrets until you're deemed to be ready to find out what's behind that door. So all of these things have purpose and meaning, but they're very personal. So the concept is that you are everybody and everything in your dream. And so by going through this, you get to what all of those people and objects mean. Now, when I first heard that, I said, well, what if I dream about my nephew? Aren't I dreaming about my nephew? And then I thought about it. Well, no, I'm not inside of his head. I'm not inside of his life. What I'm doing, I'm projecting my regard for this. I mean, he's my primary family member, this nephew that I helped bring into the world. And so it's my hopes for him, my aspirations. Like, he does a lot of rock climbing, and he wants to do ice climbing, you know, climbing frozen waterfalls. Like, that's really dangerous. And so I have some fear about one of these days he's be pursuing one of his interests and he's going to die in the process. And that freaks me out. So I told him, when he described ice climbing, I said, do me a favor. Don't tell me that you're going to do this until you come home afterwards. And then you can tell me all about it. But I don't want to hear about it until you come home safely. So he's really important to me. So if he's appearing in a dream, it's not really him. It's what he means to me. It's a place that he holds in my life. Like I say, he's my primary family member because my mother, father, sister are all passed away. And my brother, I'm not as close to my brother as I am to this nephew. So this kid is really important to me. Well, he's not a kid, he's 40 now, but kind of a kid to me. So it's his relevance in my life that I'm dreaming about, not him, not his reality. It's the role that he plays in my life and how important he is to me. So when there's other people in your dream, it's not really them that you're dreaming about, but the role they play in your life or how important they are. So I really find that Gestalt dream analysis and the approach to art analysis are really quite effective. Now, Gestalt therapy can also be kind of confrontive. So there's a lot of it I don't use with survivors of sexual abuse. One of the things that they do is I'll put the client in the hot seat. So I notice that your legs are crossed. What's that all about? And I give your hand over. What's that all about? Your eyes are kind of squinted. What's that all about? So they can't even take a breath without just saying, I notice that you're doing this. What's that all about? Like it feels like, especially if you're doing it in some kind of a group context, it feels like, you know, the old proverbial scene and the detective is, you know, the light is swinging and where were you on the night of, you know. It feels like you're under this intense scrutiny and it's really uncomfortable. So I don't do that with clients. That is an exercise we don't do. There's a Gestalt object exercise that I've actually done with groups, and actually it might have been interesting to do it with the people here because there aren't that many of you, but anyway, I'm just going to explain it. So I'll bring in a whole bunch of exercises. It might be a pine cone, a broken cup, a stapler, a die from dice, a crayon. I'll bring in enough objects for a rock, maybe a shell. So I bring in enough objects for each person in the room. So right before break, I'll say, we're going to do an object exercise. I want you to look at the objects on the table, and I want you to pick up one that appeals to you. And during break, I want you to feel that object, hold it in your hand, feel the weight of it, feel the texture of it. Think about what it is, a rock, a shell, whatever. And then after we come back from break, then we'll continue with this exercise. So they come in, and so I'll ask the person, okay, I want you to describe your object as if you're the object. So, okay, I'm a shell. There used to be life inside of me, but the life is not there anymore. And I've been discarded, and I'm sitting on the beach. Somebody might come along and pick me up. Maybe I'll just get washed back out to sea again. If you give the same object to 8 different people and have them separately describe that object as if they are that object, you're going to get 8 different interpretations. What you will see in the object is characteristics that match how you see yourself. There was a woman that drew a die, and it was an interesting. It wasn't the die with the dots on it, the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. They had face cards on it. There was the ace, the king, the queen, the ace, the joker. I don't know what all was on it. But she picked up the die and she held that. And so she said, okay, well, obviously I'm the queen, my husband's the king, and my son is the joker. And he was in an accident and he was disfigured in a car accident. She said, this die is a fucker. And she threw it across the room. Because that really tapped into a real critical family dynamic. The son was in a car accident, he was disfigured, and they have a lot of pain around that. He's going to have to live with that disfigurement for the rest of his life. So that was a painful reality, and that's what she read into the die. Now somebody else would have read in something completely different. Let's say the person drew a pine cone. Well, I'm a pine cone, I hold the seeds of life within me, but only the right conditions will release that life out into the world where new life can be created. Or it might be, you know, I'm a pine cone, I've been discarded, I'm kind of starting to decompose, and before too long I'm just going to disappear into the earth. Well, that's a different kind of interpretation about the pine cone. So it's an interesting exercise, and you know, some of these things people look at, you're like kind of strange. Well, I'm a shell, I'm a pine cone, what are you talking about? But with all of these exercises, it's really the debriefing afterwards that where you really get to the substance of the exercise. So that's an exercise that I do use. There are also the two-chair method, where, okay, I want you to imagine that your offender is sitting in that chair, and I want you to say what you want to say to that person. Now, they can't answer back. They just have to sit there and listen. Now, for some people, that's so real that they actually, it's like they see the person sitting in that chair. It doesn't work for me. I'm pretty literal. I was like, I'm talking to an empty chair, and it doesn't really work for me. So, of course, you know, none of these exercises work unless the client can get into it. If they don't want to talk, you know, about being a shell, it's not going to work. If they can't actually imagine their offender sitting in that empty chair, it's not going to work. But for some clients, it's really powerful because they find their voice. They're able to say to the offender all the things that it's not safe to say to the offender in real life. But the imaginary offender sitting in the chair, they can do that. There's also a two-chair method where the client moves from chair to chair. So they're having a conversation with two aspects of the self, or they can have a conversation with the offender, but they say, you know, what you did to me was wrong. And then they step into the chair and they come back with some rebuttal from the offender that they think is probably going to be the comeback from the offender. It may not be what the offender actually says, but if they think that the offender is going to rationalize and justify, that's the response that they're going to get when they sit in the offender chair. And that dialogue can go back and forth. Now, this is something I don't really feel a lot comfortable with, because I don't like the idea of the offender sitting in the skin of or the client sitting in the skin of the offender. So it doesn't feel really right to me. Like, why would I want my clients to role play being a sex offender? Now, some people have done that and it's been effective, but it's just not something that I feel comfortable with. That brings me to a thing that's called therapeutic reenactment. And a couple of my staff have been trained in that. What's his first name? The person that does this in Vancouver, his last name is Wedgwood, I think, and I can't remember his first name. Anyway, two of my staff had studied with him and learned about therapeutic reenactment. And I participated one weekend, and we would have like 3 or 4 clients, and we would work together for the weekend. Like, we would, only during the day, we'd all go home at night, but we'd come back the next day. So each client had an opportunity to set up a scenario. And then everybody in the room would be assigned a certain role. Now, the parameters were that we'd have like 5 or 6 therapists in the room and maybe 3 or 4 clients. Well, therapists could play the role of an offender, other clients couldn't. But when it's your time to set up a scenario, other survivors can play a supportive role. Could be the sibling that was really on your side, was the one that you could really talk to when things got crazy. And so there was one scenario where the client set up this scene where the offender was present, and it got to a point where the client was pushing the offender out of the room. Now, the therapist playing the role of the offender put up enough resistance that he could really feel himself pushing against this guy and feeling the resistance, but ultimately the victim won. And the person playing the offender was pushed out of the room, the door was closed, and was not allowed to come back into the room until the scene was finished and we debriefed the scene. And then he was able to come back into the room. What was interesting is this client stuttered chronically. But after that session, he wasn't stuttering for the rest of the day, because the stuttering was a product of the abuse. And because he had empowered himself that he was victorious over the offender, he really felt his strength, and the stuttering stopped. Now, I probably under stress or stress or duress or something, it may be that he will stutter again, but it really was a very obvious shift. we played another role play where I played the cousin who was an MLA, and the client had been abused by his mother. And I was a cousin, and I was going on, it was the mother's funeral. And as the cousin, I was saying, oh, you know, Aunt June was really quite the card. She was always quick with a joke, and some were kind of off-colored, but, you know, she was pretty funny. And then my cousin, the client, confronted me, said, you know, maybe that's how you experienced her, but she abused me. And this is, you know, he went on to describe what she had done to him. And I said, I'm so sorry, I didn't know. And if I had known, I wouldn't have thought that she was such a great person, but I didn't experience her that way, and I'm so sorry that you did. And be able to shift that reality so that there was family awareness now where we had not been aware in the past, and that what had been obliviousness to the abuse was now recognition, acknowledgement, and support. So again, that shift in the dynamic where, now this was not their real experience, but they were able to experience something from a different perspective, and it helped them discover a certain amount of empowerment. And it really can be quite productive. But it's, again, something that you need to be trained in. So it's another kind of creative therapy. I had an art therapist that led a cycle of group quite a few years ago, towards the beginning. So she had 12 sessions with her clients, and every session, the clients would produce a mandala. A mandala is basically a circular design where concentric rings have elements of session. At the end of the session, every client would line up all of their 12 mandala, and they would talk about the progression that was articulated in the construction of each consecutive mandala. So that was another art therapy exercise that was quite effective. One time we had a staff development day, and we invited a couple of staff members to present some kind of intervention that they used that would inform all of our staff so they could incorporate that new technique. Now, one of the therapists, the art therapist, brought in these clear masks, and he brought in paint and feathers and sequins and all kinds of stuff. And so we were all meant to create a mask of ourselves reflecting how we bring ourselves into our work. And I created these really big open eyes on mine. And that was about my observation, how important it is for me to be aware and to observe, and how I incorporate my observation into my work with my clients. One of my staff had a cross on hers. Now, this was a woman who was a born-again Christian. And I had no idea that that was her religious affiliation, which was a good thing. Because one thing you don't want to do is impose your religious ideology on your clients. The thing is that she had worked with us for months before I knew that she was a born-again Christian, because she understood that it was inappropriate for her to impose her religious orientation on her clients. Now, undoubtedly, if a client brings up religion, we're going to explore that. But I'm not going to say, oh, well, I was raised Catholic and now I walked away from the Catholic Church, and the fact that they tried to cover up all the abuse, I just have no... That's not relevant. So one time a client was bringing up his religious affiliations, and I was asking about it, and he said to me, why are you challenging my religious belief systems? And I said, oh, I'm not challenging them. I think they're fine. I just want to understand the role that your religion and your spirituality plays in your life. How does it help you deal with your trauma? I'm not criticizing it or judging it. I just want to understand how it fits into your world paradigm or your worldview. He said, oh, okay, well, that's all right then. And then we went on to talk about it. But at first he thought I was judgmental of his religion. So where religion comes up, it's really important that we just really have an open attitude. In fact, being open and receptive and non-judgmental is so important when you're working with survivors of trauma. I've had a couple of clients that disclose bestiality. Now, if I say like, oh, you know, that's a judgment, you know, and still, instead of reacting like that, I mean, obviously I think that bestiality is not healthy or appropriate, not for the individual, not for the animal. Like, it's wrong. But that's not up to me to put out my judgment. So instead of reacting like, ooh, in some kind of judgmental say, I said, okay, well, how did you end up getting into that? So he talked about the kid at the neighboring farm that was getting into it and introduced him to it. And so he tried it out and it was kind of okay. So if I was judgmental, that would have been the end of the discussion. But since I said, oh, well, that's interesting, how did you end up getting into that? We're able to explore what that was all about. Well, obviously, it's not something that he continued. At some point, he realized, well, yeah, that is kind of weird. But that was for him to reach that conclusion on his own. That's not up to me. So quite often, you hear all kinds of things from people. And it's important that you not throw your judgment out there, because then the exploration stops. So you have to remain open and just say, well, how did you end up getting into that? Okay, what's that all about? How does that fit into your worldview? And you're going to learn a lot more about your client if you keep your judgments to yourself. In fact, I remember doing a training seminar, and the first thing I did is leave your judgments at the door, because you need to approach this with an open mind and not really be open. You don't have to agree with everything you hear, but at least have to understand what it's all about and where it's coming from. I think we're coming close up to a lunch break. Is that right? What time is it?
It's about 11:21.
Okay, well, we were a little bit ahead of time, so let's just go a little bit more. I had a client, a student that came to us, and she stuck around as a paid therapist for a while, and she was from a university in Switzerland. She was Canadian, but she had done her studies in Switzerland, and she was studying creative therapies. And she used visual art, art therapy like I just described. She used movement therapy. She used sound. She used music. Anything that's any kind of expression other than just talking. So if she said to a client, well, how are you feeling right now? Well, I don't know how I feel. So she said, okay, well, if that feeling was emotion, what would that look like? I don't know. Oh, maybe it would look like this. Well, that kind of looks like anger to me. Oh, yeah, I guess maybe it is. So by using movement as a way to express what's going on emotionally, she would help clients tap in and articulate what's going on an emotional level. Some people use drumming. I had a group that was really into trying that out. So we brought in all these objects, an overturned a pail. We didn't have that many drums to use, but anything that would make a percussive sound, and we were all just tapping away on whatever it was that we had. And that was kind of interesting, because at first it was all kind of cacophony. It was all this, everything was all just no rhythm. It was all over the place. But eventually we all got in sync. And we started creating these really kind of organized, connected rhythms. Like we weren't all doing the same thing, but somehow all our various rhythms really blended, and we created this really kind of, really nice blended drumming sound. And if you've ever been to a drumming circle, that's kind of what happens. At first, everyone's trying to do their own drumming rhythms, but eventually they all kind of get into lockstep, and they create fairly complex but very coordinated, well-blended rhythms. It's really kind of beautiful to be part of that. So, those are some of the creative therapies that she would use: sound, music, motion, visual imagery. I would really like to, when we get this ideal house, I want to have an art studio where people can work with paint, clay, sculpture, all kinds of mediums. So that whatever medium they're using, it's the one that really allows them to express what they want to express. I've got several thousand wooden blocks at home. And sometimes when I feel like I really need to tap into my creativity, I create these elaborate sculptures using these blocks. They're not glued so that I can take it apart. And I'll have these, I have 16-foot ceilings in my apartment, so I can create these really tall sculptures made out of these blocks. They're 1/2 inch thick, 1.5 inches wide, and 4 inches long. I think that's right. So that 3 of them flat is the same as 1 on its side, and 3 on the side is the same as 1 on its end, so you can change the directions. So I get these kind of interesting patterns that I can build. I've got a couple pictures on my Facebook page of sculptures, of a sculpture that I built. And I had a roommate that we created these blocks together when I was in university, and we had 7,000 of these blocks. In our living room, we'd have this miniature city. We'd have these towers going from floor to ceiling. But one thing we did, we'd also build these towers with stop action photography. So, stop action video. So you build this, you put it on a few blocks, you do a frame, you put on some more blocks, you do a frame, you do more blocks, you build. So we built the whole thing. So when you run the video, it looks like this thing is just growing because we're never in the frame. So it was really kind of neat. And we would do close-up photography and all kinds of really kind of interesting things. So because art is an important part of who I am, even though I don't have a lot of time to do art, I realize the value of creative expression. So you don't have to be an artist yourself to integrate some of these strategies into the work that you do with your clients. So it's not just about talk therapy. Remember I talked about somatic awareness, about artistic expression. There's a lot of different tools that you can use to really help clients tap into what's going on in the subconscious or on a deeper level. So any questions or responses to what I've covered so far as we lead up to our lunch break? Now, I noticed the two of you are, yeah.
What kind of, like percentage-wise do you think you get of success of some of it? Like, you have like kind of a mixed bag of tools, but when they go through your program, like how many success stories, like percentage-wise? Like, do you have a attrition rate or what?
I would say we probably have about a 95% success rate.
And that's amazing.
It is, but we're highly successful, and a big part of that is because we honor each individual client's unique style, pace. We don't impose something on them. We have our best perception of this client. We try to really offer things that we think match who they are based on our perceptions or what they share with us. And we're not afraid to go into those dark, scary memories. And we know how to go into the memories and help clients find their way out. I think I described the client who was on the floor and his father was hitting him. And by allowing him to find his voice, to be able to stand up and confront his father where his father could not respond back, yeah, it was just a role play, more or less, but it really made a difference. Now, we've worked with probably easily over 12,000 clients of highly traumatized people. We've had maximum 6 suicides over 30 years. And that's a phenomenal statistic given our population. And at least one of those might have been an accidental suicide. So we have a range of strategies that we can draw on. There's more than I'm going to be talking about after lunch. So we've got a repertoire. Now, when you do a master program, you're encouraged to pick a discipline and stick with it. Gestalt therapy, neuro-linguistic program, narrative therapy, Jungian therapy, whatever. We're supposed to pick one discipline and stick with it. Well, I did not like that idea. I did not want to be limited to one approach to doing therapy. So I chose Lazarus and his multimodal approach, which allows a broader scope. And that allowed me to get away with incorporating other things into the way I approach therapy. But as the staff grew, they all come in with their own discipline. And we've got some narrative therapists, we've got some Adlerian therapists, we've got some that come from Buddhist mindfulness practices, we've got some that come from psychodynamic orientation. We all learn from each other. And we've had art therapists. And we had this creative arts therapist that used all kinds of different ways of creative expression. And we all learn from each other, and we all incorporate. And it was interesting that some years ago, I had some interns. And one was an intern from Israel. And one of the therapists who has a narrative orientation was going on about narrative therapy. I'm a narrative therapist, and narrative therapy is the way to go. And this woman from Israel, who also had a master's degree already, but she didn't have a lot of experience working with male survivors, so she was doing 100 hours of internship with us before she became a staff member. Anyway, she said to him, "You're too new in this business to decide what you're all about. It's fine that you've studied narrative therapy, and of course it has value, but not all of your clients are going to work well in narrative therapy. You have to be open enough to incorporate other things that are going to be more appropriate and more effective with a given client. So don't decide so soon that you're all about this." I was thought, because I do think it's important to be open to more learning. And like I said, I've been doing this for 30 years, and as soon as I think I know it all, it's time for me to stop because I'll stop being effective. I have to remain open to new ways of doing this work. new ways of being effective. And if I'm not, my effectiveness is going to start dropping off because only so many people are going to fit with my style. If I can't adjust my style, all these other people aren't going to fit. So being open to growing and changing, incorporating newer strategies is really important if you're working in this kind of trauma-oriented work. It's interesting. I think that you have to have awareness about sexual abuse and historical trauma, regardless of what kind of work you're doing. If you're an alcohol and drug counselor, you need to know. If you're an employment counselor, you need to know. The registrar of BC Association of Clinical Counselors is a good friend of mine. We used to be learning specialists while we were going to university, teaching learning and study skills, and we became really good friends. We used to hang out a lot. She said to me one day, she said, I have no interest in working with sexual abuse or that kind of trauma. And I said, Angela, you're a therapist. You may not want to be identified as a trauma therapist, but you need to understand, if you're an employment counselor and your client can't hold down a job, you need to know that the trauma is getting in the way of them being able to hold down a job. Their trust issues or their problems with authority are a product of their abuse. Now, you may not want to get in there and resolve their trauma, but you have to understand that trauma is part of the problem and why they can't hold down a job. Yeah.
That kind of leads me to my next question about initial support. We have a few people here that are interested and they volunteer a lot of their time working with the community, and we're not necessarily professionals, and a lot of the problems that we would have, the grassroots level, is that we're not trained in like you mentioned about how hard it is to get into the dark secrets, and
Yeah.
I mean, the gut reaction I had to some of the anecdotes you've told are it's very difficult. And I've listened to some of your stories, and that for some reason I'm not traumatized and I've been able to swallow it. But what are some tools that you could recommend to regular people who want to volunteer hours, and what kind of, I don't know if you're going into that more with the last part of your seminar, but that's what I'd like to know is how regular people can, and that's where a lot of our support's going to come from anyways,
Sure.
financial. And so what can we do as a community of all types, working class people in all walks of life,
Right.
to provide that initial support?
Right. Well, I kind of touched on a little bit here and there, but let me be more specific about it. If a client comes to you as a lay person, let's say, you're not trained, but you're a caring person, and if they say to you, I really need to talk about this, I was sexually abused when I was a child, your response is, I'm really sorry to hear that. And undoubtedly that's the root of a lot of the problems that you've been having in life. But I'm not trained to deal with that. So I don't think it's really important that you talk to me about that. I think it's really important you talk to these people because they're trained. That's what the alcohol and drug counselors do, the good ones. They say, it's important that you understand that is playing a role in your addictions, but I'm not trained to deal with it. So I encourage you to talk to these people. And that way you avoid hearing the stories that you're going to get overwhelmed by. If someone does spill their story, just take a deep breath and center yourself, whatever it takes for you to find your center. And to know that it's not your responsibility to make it okay for them. All you have to do is hear it and say, I'm really sorry that happened to you. That's terrible. I'm really sorry. You don't deserve it. It's not your fault. That's all you have to say. You don't have to unpack it. You don't have to impose therapeutic interventions. Just validate. Listen and accept what you have to say, what the client has to say. We have a video that we produced way back when. It was called From Disclosure to Justice. And we have 8 clients that were interviewed as part of that video. And one of them said, it's really important that I be heard. You don't have to really understand. I just want you to listen. I just want you to hear what I have to say. And that's all they need. They need to be able to say what they have to say without you saying, oh, well, that can't happen, or that's in the past, just get over it. That's the kind of stuff that people hear from people that don't know what they're talking about.
Which is a lot of the rhetoric we hear in a lot of our institutions.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, ideologues have trained our police and our mental health services with some certain problematic ideologies, I'd say.
Yeah.
So, like you mentioned about men not being believed and whatnot, so they probably hear that quite a bit.
Yeah, oh yeah, I mean, people think they're being helpful. You know, that was in the past, just forget about it and move on. Well, if it was possible to forget about it and move on, well, that'd be great.
Yeah.
But it's your history and your abreactive behaviors, all the ways in which you've been able to frame that experience in order to sort of continue in life in some way. You either kill yourself or you make up some kind of story that allows you to continue to exist on this planet. And some of those stories are self-sabotaging. They may have worked at some point, but they're not working now. It's prevented you from really establishing yourself in life, to a career, a relationship, a family, you know, a sense of purpose. The trauma gets in the way. You can tell yourself, oh yeah, well that didn't really matter, but why are you drinking? Why are you drugging? Why do your relationships fall apart after 3 or 4 weeks? Like, what's going on there? You can tell yourself it's no big deal all you want, but something's going on. So when you say, forget about it, get on with life, you're really kind of fostering that false sense of normalcy. So what you need to say is, you didn't deserve it. I'm really sorry that happened to you. It shouldn't have happened. It's not your fault. As much as I believe in you, I really don't know how to help you with that, but these people do. Make sure you know who's available in your community. I've spoken to med students at UBC on several occasions. They have this thing once a year where they have a video teleconference, where they have what's it called? There's a university in northern BC, there's UBC, there's Simon Fraser, there's UVic. And they've got everyone participating in this through closed circuit television or whatever you call it. So they'll have a guest speaker from each one of those locations, and then anybody from any location can step up to the mic and they show up on the screen and you can ask a question and so on. So I've been part of that, and I've been in the audience, I've never been one of the speakers. But then they break down, each location breaks down into smaller groups. And so then I'll take 8 or 10 pre-med students, intro room, and I'll talk about abuse and that kind of thing. And I said to them, I said, if you're decided that you're going into psychiatric medicine, that's fine. But you need to understand that medicating a client is not, or a patient, they call them, medicating a patient is not the solution. Medication is only a coping strategy. It does not resolve that person's trauma. You need to go back into the client's trauma and resolve those histories. Now, if you're not prepared to do that, that's fine. And you can give them some mild antidepressants so they don't kill themselves, but you need to refer them to someone that's prepared to do that trauma work. So find out who's in your community. Formulate cooperative cross-referral relationships with trauma therapists, because maybe the trauma therapist needs to come to you and say, my client is so overwhelmed right now that we can't do the work. Can you prescribe something that's going to moderate his psycho-emotional state so that he can do the work? And if you have that dialogue where you work together with the psychiatrist, then you can work very effectively with the client, where you have the right balance of medication and the kind of trauma work that I've been spending 2 days talking about. But you really have to make sure that people that are being volunteered, validate their willingness and their compassion and their care for other human beings, but make sure that they know that their parameters only go so far. Validation and support, that's it. No exploratory work. That's where you need the skill set. And make sure that they're supported. That if you feel like you're getting overwhelmed by this work, come and talk to me. Or talk to the psychologist or the therapist on part of the organization. So there needs to be support for people, regardless, from the psychiatrist down to the volunteer driver that takes people to their appointments. We all need to have the support in place that we feel we've got some place to turn to when we feel overwhelmed. All my staff can come into my office anytime that I got my door open, and I could debrief with them after a session. Also, once a month, we have 2 hours of case consultation with the registered psychologist, where we all get together and somebody will present a case and we'll all brainstorm ideas about how to work more effectively with that client. And sometimes some really good ideas come up. And interestingly enough, sometimes the students are kind of new to the whole field. Some of their ideas are the ones that really connect and land, and that's the solution for this particular dilemma. Sometimes those sessions end up not being about a case, but about what it feels like to deal with some of these people. Clients that freak out in sessions and start yelling and screaming and pounding the furniture, that's really stressful. So how do you deal with that? Clients that are challenging, they through transference, they take out their anger on you. And how do you deal with that? So quite often our therapy, our case consultation sessions are not about a case, but how we are dealing with the issues that are coming up with difficult clients, resistant clients, recalcitrant clients, clients that are challenging, clients that are testing. It really helps for us all to sort of talk about these things and feel supported. Now, I really wonder how private practitioners, without any kind of decompression team, how do they possibly stay in the business without getting burned out or emotionally overwhelmed? So I really encourage, even if you're in private practice, to get together with another group of therapists and meet together, maybe even once a month, and go over cases and talk about what it's like to do this work. Supervision is really important. Now, it doesn't matter how skilled you are, how much experience you have to be able to go and unload something every now and then. So one of our supervisors, you came up with an analogy that I use now with clients. A client has their nose against the painting. All they see are the brushstrokes. The therapist who's across the room can see the whole image, can see the picture. Well, the supervisor is very similar. Your clinical supervisor sees the whole picture. Well, you've got your nose up against the painting and you're seeing the brushstrokes. So likewise, you need that supervisor that has enough distance to see the global picture. Now, I was going to a supervisor one time. I kind of got into a difficult place with a client. And so I was talking about with my therapist, and one of the things that I'd done, as my mom was in the last stages of Alzheimer's, so I knew that I was going to get the phone call and I was going to be catching a flight to Oregon to spend the last couple days with Mom before she passes. So I said to my client, who always was nervous about me leaving town because they needed me to be around, but they were also afraid that I would die in some fiery plane crash somewhere and that, they would have no support. So I said, I need to let you know that I may have to leave town on short notice. I should have stopped there, but I felt like I needed to give an explanation. So I said, my mom's in the last stages of Alzheimer's, and I want to be with her in the end. Well, survivors are trained caregivers. So every session after that, well, how's your mom doing? Well, it was so upfront for me, I couldn't help but talk about it. Well, how's your dad dealing with all this? I couldn't help but talk about it. So 10 or 15 minutes in the session was me talking about my stuff. And I got caught up in it before I even realized it. My supervisor said, all you needed to say was, I may need, sometimes I can't talk, maybe I'm tired. I may need to leave town on short notice. I just want to let you know in advance, and stop there. They don't need to know anything else. But you open the door for the caretaker to come forward and take over the session. Wrong. So that was a really good learning experience for me, is to understand where my limits are. To share your personal story only with the person who should be hearing it. So I was going to my supervisor and talking about the end of my mother's life, and then my sister was dying of cancer, and so I had to go and see my supervisor and talk about that. It was not appropriate for me to bring up this stuff in my therapy sessions. It didn't matter that I might have to leave town on short notice to be with one of these people as they pass. That's not their business, that's mine. But it's enough to say, I might be going out of town sometime in the next couple weeks. I'll give you as much notice as possible. That's as far as I go. So that brings me to the last thing I want to point out before we go on to our lunch break, and that's the idea of self-disclosure. Now, as therapists, we have to be very careful about what we share about ourselves. But that doesn't mean that we're a sphinx or an enigma. We are real people. And I had a client say to me that if I couldn't get a sense of who you are, I won't be able to trust you. I know that we're not friends, but I have to feel friendly towards you in order to trust you. So I need to know something about you. So what I say to my students is that if you self-disclose anything, it has to be relevant to the issue that the client's working on, and it has to be something that you've resolved. Now, sometimes clients need to know whether your therapist is a survivor of sexual abuse or not, and I've had clients ask me that. And because I'm not, I'll say, well, no, fortunately I was not sexually abused, but I was bullied in high school. But that is so long ago resolved that it's not something that's a big issue. But if I'm kind of grappling with the fact that, I'm 70 now and I'm aging and I'm retiring is facing me, and how am I going to support myself after retirement, because you don't get a pension when you work for a nonprofit society, that's not relevant for me to share with my clients. It's not their business, and it's something that I'm dealing with right now in my life. So I don't need to bring that into the session. But I can talk about bullying in high school, because my mom was really great with helping me with that. She said, it's not about you. These people are probably unhappy kids. They probably have a lot of trouble at home, and they're just taking it out on you. It's not about you. I'm sorry you have to deal with it, but it's not about you. So that really helped me deal with it. I really didn't internalize it in any way. And I had to, I'd walk up to the high school, and this anxiety would come over me. It's going to happen today. Am I going to be able to avoid it? But, I got through it, and it was all right. And it didn't become some kind of a lifetime problem. So again, any kind of self-disclosure has to be very limited to something that's really relevant to a topic that you're focusing on, and has to be something that you have completely resolved. You don't want to bring your baggage into the room, but you can bring your insight and your personal learning, and that's relevant. So that's something. Last minute questions or comments before we, yeah.
How many hours would you find that it takes for clients to open up to you about their real problem and not just something superficial?
Probably about 20 minutes.
So they're coming willingly to your office.
Yeah.
They're ready to tell you.
They called the Male Survivors of Sexual Abuse Agency, and they said, hi, I want to come in, I want to get in and do some therapy. Well, they identify themselves as survivors of sexual abuse by making that phone call. But now that we also have men who are victims of domestic violence, they're going to be one or the other. So during that initial contact, we'll say, are you a survivor of sexual abuse, or is it domestic violence? Okay, it's this one. All right, fine. So they come in for the session, for the intake, we ask them, who were you abused by? If it was sexual abuse, mother, father, teacher, stranger, how old were you, et cetera, et cetera. If it was domestic violence, all right, so how long have you and your partner been together? Are you still together, or have you separated? So right away, we're talking about the issues, because they have identified by making that initial phone call. Now, if it was a general practice therapy, like a family counseling or whatever, you might have a number of weeks, before, especially for men, before they would have the trust and the comfort with the whole process to say, well, I also need to talk about the fact that I was abused as a kid. Now, that might be weeks down the road if it's a general issue kind of service. But because it's specific to sexual abuse and domestic violence, we're on that page already. So it doesn't take long. Yeah.
You talked about some of the complex needs of some of the men that approach her. So there's complex health issues at stake where maybe you or another advocate would approach a psychiatrist for drugs or whatever. Sometimes that's necessary.
Mm-hmm.
So one issue that we have is that it's very difficult to get men to advocate for their own health and participate that way. And so if you're having complex needs, they would have to participate and contribute. So what do you recommend for our kind of group, how to encourage that and to advocate for their own health?
Well, yeah, I think sometimes that can be tricky, but sometimes men just need to have their attention called to certain issues. I talk about diet with clients. What does diet have to do with trauma? But if this physical vehicle is not healthy, your psycho-emotional vehicle is not going to be able to function very well. So I talk about diet, and probably a couple of years ago now, I've forgotten when, I really shifted to a more predominantly alkaline diet. And alkaline foods are things like green vegetables, certain fruits are low in alkaline, or alkaline, kale, broccoli, spinach, things like that are alkaline. Now the high acid diets are like grains, meat, sugars, those kinds of things. And if you go online and you Google alkaline versus acid diet, you'll get a chart with the high alkaline foods on this and the high acid foods on this end, and the sort of neutral foods in the middle. Now the thing about that is that microorganisms and cancer cells will thrive in an acid environment, but they do not thrive in an alkaline environment. So if your body is an alkaline environment, those negative microorganisms, cancer cells, will not survive. You're not feeding them with the acidic foods, sugar and whatnot, so they will die off. So I encourage clients to incorporate, like you don't have to stop eating the things that you normally eat, but make sure you bring in more of these alkaline foods to have more of a balance in your diet. And some people follow up on that and they say, well, I don't have time to cook and it's so much easier just to go to McDonald's. Well, I say, okay, but they have salads there now. So get a salad along with your burger. At least you're getting a little bit of both. I talk about sleep etiquette, how to improve a person's sleep issues. And remember I described the client who couldn't sleep at night because he felt so unsafe? And I instructed him to go around and lock all the windows and doors. I've done that with a number of clients. And it was interesting. I had another client that his bedroom had stuff all over the floor, magazines, papers, clothes, stuff, whatever. And it was an obstacle course between the door and his bed. And he knew how to navigate his way through that obstacle course so that he could get to bed. Well, when I really identified that as a safety tool, that's a way to really to minimize the possibility of somebody getting at him because he's created this obstacle course. Then I encouraged him to go around, lock the windows, lock the doors, ensure that he's safe in his environment. But I think it was a self-advocacy point that needed to be brought to his attention. It may be kind of dysfunctional because his room is a mess, but it is giving him a feeling of safety. And so he is helping to take care of himself. And that was an important thing to put out there. So there are ways that you can lead people to certain kinds of self-care behaviors without addressing more directly the abuse. You can kind of talk around the periphery. But if people are starting to take better care of themselves, they're going to be better able to deal with the deeper stuff as you move in closer to the bigger issues.
And on that note, we'll break for lunch.
All right.
We'll return in approximately 1 hour.
All right.